Imagine this. You wake up in a city that hums with precise routines, coffee machines, notifications, measured smiles, and for a moment, you feel a strange hollow where conviction should be. You catch your reflection in a train window and do not recognize the person who smiles back. Their eyes are safe, rehearsed. Thinking, in its rawest form, feels like stepping into a room where the lights are switched off and the furniture is rearranged every minute. What do you do? Turn on the light, or keep moving with the crowd because darkness is less disruptive when everyone else pretends it is not there. There is a paradox here that slams like an unseen door. Thinking is supposed to be the loftiest act of freedom, the thing that distinguishes you from routine, the pledge of individuality. Yet most people avoid it, clinging instead to platitudes, to the comfortable narratives supplied by institutions and peers. How can the capacity that promises emancipation instead become the source of exile? You feel the tension tightening in your chest, an existential tightness, like the moment before a truth you half know arrives. What if the reason thinking is avoided is not laziness but danger? What if thought is an arsonist that threatens the home of a carefully constructed identity? When you think truly, you open the door to questions that demand reconfiguration. Beliefs, loyalties, self-images. Thought asks you to become someone you might not like. Is survival the real motive behind ignorance? This is where Nietzsche's voice prowls through the narrative. He calls the comfortable majority the herd, and diagnoses a moral economy built on avoidance. Herd morality rewards sameness, muffles contradiction, and exalts obedience because thinking in its uncompromising mode shakes the foundations of belonging. But Nietzsche's diagnosis is not merely a social complaint, it is psychological. You recognize this. Thought excavates deep layers of feeling and belief, and what you uncover is often not noble. Jung called this the shadow, the repository of impulses and vulnerabilities you deny. When you refuse to look, the shadow is projected outwards as blame, as the resentment Nietzsche names ressentiment. Do you prefer the safety of projection over the hazard of self-confrontation? Feel the cinematicness of the scene. A theater in which everyone claps at the same moment. A projector that shows only approved images, shadows moving in sync. Your curiosity stirs, and you imagine an empty seat at the edge. You could sit there and watch differently, but the seat is cold, and the price of watching is isolation. What do you value, the warmth of the crowd or the cold clarity of solo thought? Which is the truer measure of a life? Ask yourself, is thinking a solitary peril or a civic duty? Does the abandonment of thought produce comfort? Or does it breed the deeper malaise Nietzsche feared nihilism dressed in respectable habits? Once belief is unreflectively inherited, its meaning drains away. You learn to speak its words, but their echo is hollow. Is this not a kind of death by repetition? And yet, if thinking fractures the social bonds on which you subsist, can it ever be practical? Consider the cost-benefit ledger that governs private lives. Instincts orient you toward survival. The mind, when asked to think critically, often signals risk. You may lose friends, status, certainties. Nietzsche insists that most will choose the security of the herd over the loneliness of free thought. Jung would add that until you integrate your shadow, until you undergo individuation thinking, will be resisted because it forces an encounter with unacceptable inner truths. How often have you found yourself quick to dismiss a challenging idea simply because it threatens a comfortable narrative? Questions orbit you like a broken carousel. What would you lose if you truly examined your beliefs? Whom would you disappoint? What raw, unarranged feelings would surface if you stopped using reason as ornament and used it as excavation? Can you bear the solitude that genuine thinking evokes? And more challenging still, can you bear the responsibility it demands? A final, sharper paradox cuts through. Thought promises autonomy, yet it demands a courage that most would rather not pay. The very act that could make you sovereign exacts from you a surrender to truth, to discomfort, and to change. Which will you choose, the quiet complicity of the herd, or the volatile sovereignty of a mind that thinks? Hold that question. The path forward is not merely philosophical curiosity. It is a confrontation with Nietzsche's diagnosis and Jung's therapeutic map. Prepare to see why thinking is not a hobby for the idle, but a test trial that splits comfort from conviction, cowardice from courage. In the next breath, we'll examine the mechanisms that make thinking so perilous and the psychological strategies people use to avoid it. You have already felt the chill of that empty seat at the edge of the theater. Now feel the gravity that pulls most people back into the aisle. It is not mere sloth that keeps them clapping in unison, but a complex subterranean architecture of fear, appetite, and habit, an architecture Nietzsche named in other words: herd instincts, moral comfort, and the substitution of action for thinking. What appears as avoidance is often an economy of survival, which is to say, thought threatens the carefully costumed identity you wear, and therefore it is avoided not because thinking is hard, but because it endangers everything you have built to be safe. Think of Jung's shadow as an attic in your psyche, where unwanted truths are boxed and labeled danger. You do not descend into the attic because the air is cold and the floorboards creak, with the risk of what might tumble out: guilt, rage, petty motives, cowardly choices. But when those boxes are never opened, their contents leak through the walls. Projection becomes politics. Secret shame becomes public blame. Nietzsche's term ressentiment lives here and embittered. Moral economy, where impotence is transformed into moral superiority. Isn't it easier, in the end, to condemn than to confront? When you point outward, you needn't look inward. Psychology gives you the mechanism. Cognitive dissonance insists that conflicting beliefs create unbearable tension. The mind will bend, rationalize, and lie to itself rather than rearrange the furniture of identity. Motivated reasoning is the skilled architect of comfort, crafting narratives that preserve status, relationships, and the sense that you are a decent person. Sartre's phrase, "bad faith," names the same dodge in existential terms: your refusal to own your freedom, because freedom brings dizzying responsibility. To think is to choose. To choose is to be condemned to your choices. Who wants that verdict landing on their doorstep? Social structures amplify these tendencies. Schools often teach recall over inquiry. Workplaces reward compliance over critique. Media and markets manufacture distraction. Aldous Huxley's nightmare was not only the pharmacopoeia of Soma, but a culture that administers pleasure to keep you docile. Today, algorithms tailor your discomfort away from you, delivering heatless controversies and curated outrage that never require sustained reflection. You click, you feel, you move on. Consumer capitalism converts meaning into commodities and substitutes identity with brands. If your sense of self can be purchased in a lifestyle package, why risk the expensive labor of thinking? Arthur Schopenhauer supplies another layer. The world is will and representation will, blind and painful, wants to preserve itself, and representation cushions that relentless striving. Thought, when it calls the will to account, reveals suffering and contingency. Why look at the calculus of pain if unreflective submission preserves sleep? Viktor Frankl's counterpoint is piercing. Meaning is found through responsibility and suffering. Avoidance of thinking sacrifices meaning for ease. You cannot manufacture a meaningful life by following recipes. You must pay the toll of honest appraisal. These philosophical forces are mirrored in emotional life. Anxiety is the sentinel that rings an alarm when your certainties are challenged. Shame crouches behind the curtain ready to pounce. Resentment swells when you suppress, and then see others act with the freedom you deny yourself. You become defensive, then moralistic, then performative. Identity ossifies into roles: parent, voter, professional, believer, each a costume stitched from borrowed convictions. The deeper your reliance on role, the less you avail yourself of the risky, luminous work of thinking. You speak the script, you receive applause, you never learn the author. Behavior follows the tune. Projection turns inner fault into public enemy. Scapegoating becomes a social ritual that unites the herd without ever examining its motives. Conformity is rewarded with comfort and punished with ostracism for deviation. Nietzsche foresaw the political peril. A society that prizes herd morality invites demagogues who understand that stirring resentment is a path to power. Are you surprised then when thoughtless mobs become spectacles of moral absolutism, their certainties radiating like fluorescent lights that burn out nuance? And what of identity? The self under thoughtlessness is not a self, but a compound of borrowed vocabularies, a mosaic of second-hand convictions. Jung would say you are undeveloped, stunted in individuation because you have not integrated the shadow or accepted the multiplicity of your own drives. Sartre would call you inauthentic, living as if your facticity, a set of given roles, were destiny rather than raw material. The psychological cost is slow and corrosive, a dull ache of meaninglessness, the sort Viktor Frankl saw in concentration camps, albeit on a civilized scale. You are not overtly miserable. You are quietly irrelevant to yourself, yet the danger scales beyond the individual. A polity of non-thinking citizens is a polity of simplified narratives, emotional manipulation, and shallow solidarity. Cultural creativity calcifies. Institutions become echo chambers. Responsibility blinks out like a light when citizens outsource thought to pundits, party platforms, and influencers. The deeper consequence is not merely political entropy, but a metaphysical impoverishment. The decline of the capacity to bear paradox, to tolerate ambiguity, to be morally inventive. Have you noticed how brittle public discourse becomes when people mistake certainty for virtue and doubt for cowardice? There is also a paradox of survival. You avoid thinking to preserve identity and belonging, yet by avoiding it, you invite existential dissolution. The very herd that shelters you will, in time, demand more uniformity, eroding the conditions for the individuality you secretly crave. Nietzsche's warning echoes here. A culture that squashes free spirits fosters nihilism, a vacuum filled by the loudest, not the wisest. What begins as protection ends as annihilation of subtlety and depth. So the hidden problem is not one thing but a confluence. Psychological defenses, philosophical anxieties, and societal mechanisms all conspire to make thinking costly. You are both architect and inhabitant of this conspiracy. The stakes are higher than social discomfort. They reach into the topology of your soul and the shape of collective life. If thinking is the labor that might redeem both, the question returns like a tide. Will you pay its price, or will you let the quiet death of repetition continue? The answer will reveal more than courage. It will reveal what kind of world you are willing to build. Imagine the city's hum settling into your bones, the applause still warm on your palms, and feel how quietly the trap tightens. It is not a dramatic collapse, but a patient architecture of avoidance built by thousands of tiny decisions. A retweet, a reheated opinion, a reflexive insult. Each act of not thinking concretes a passage you walk on autopilot. What you call convenience today becomes the scaffolding of tomorrow's ignorance. Do you see how ordinary gestures preferring comfort to inquiry, allegiance to curiosity sum into a societal gravity well? Neurology gives this gravity a shape. The brain is an economy of energy. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of deliberation and difficult choice, is metabolically expensive. The amygdala, quick and watchful, trades in certainty and survival. When you choose ease, you choose pathways that fire more readily. The default mode network glides into rehearsed narratives, rehearsed moralities, rehearsed resentments. Dopamine rewards certainty. Your mind registers the small rush of confirmation and seals it as a habit. Thinking, by contrast, demands sustained attention, error correction, and the discomfort of updating. It activates slow circuits that fatigue. Wouldn't you prefer the warm dopamine of belonging to the cold work of revision? Cognitive biases are the instruments of this preference. Confirmation bias is a locksmith that keeps the doors of your mind latched. Availability heuristics make recent, sensationalized snippets loom larger than sober evidence. Status quo bias arms you with a plausible story for inertia. This is how we've always done it. Sunk cost thinking whispers that you cannot afford to change the narratives you've invested in. Motivated reasoning gives eloquence to self-preservation. Each bias is a brick in the wall between you and the thought that would change you. How often do you notice these bricks being laid? Cultural conditioning amplifies the neurological and cognitive patterns into social institutions. Schools valorize rote answers. Corporate culture favors alignment over dissent. Media platforms monetize outrage and simplify complexity into shareable packets. From childhood, you are trained to answer questions rather than to live with them. Your moral imagination atrophies under curricula of certainties and performance metrics. Popular culture scripts identity as a brandware. Buy, repeat so, the labor of self-inquiry feels like absurdity when a consumer package promises identity for a price. Is it surprising that thinking becomes not only inconvenient, but economically irrational? And yet there is something more intimate, darker, and older at play. Jung's shadow is not a metaphor you can shelve. It is the psychic weight you carry when you refuse to look. When you avoid thinking, you preserve a tidy self-image while the shadow bulks up in the cellar. It leaks in whispers. A prick of envy becomes a public moral crusade. A private cowardice inflates into righteous condemnation of others. Nietzsche's ressentiment finds its currency here. You turn impotence into moral purity and call it justice. You protect yourself by projecting what you cannot bear, thereby enlisting the herd in your defense. Do you notice how moral certainty often masks a private tremor? This is the unseen violence of non-thinking. It reshapes reality by changing what counts as real. When societies stop valuing nuance, they stop training citizens to tolerate ambiguity. They produce voters who react, consumers who mimic, activists who demand clarity where complexity is required. The collective imagination narrows, and public reasoning atrophies. The consequence is not mere misinformation, but a flattened moral landscape in which deep problems are treated with slogans. Is that not terrifying? That your avoidance can, in aggregate, strip a culture of its capacity to solve anything truly difficult? There is urgency because the mechanisms are self-reinforcing. Avoidance begets more avoidance. The more you outsource judgment to authorities, algorithms, or the comforting narratives of the herd, the less practice you have at thinking, and the weaker your deliberative muscles become. Neural pathways prune away the unused circuits. Social feedback punishes deviation. Confirmation storms make alternative views seem alien. What begins as a small choice, an unwillingness to sit with discomfort, becomes a cascade that hardens into incapacity. Time, which once softened mistakes, now ossifies them. And there is an ethical urgency too. If you decline thought, you decline responsibility. Nietzsche insists that the free spirit is not merely someone who disagrees with the majority, but someone brave enough to bear the consequences of independent judgment. Jung would add that individuation, genuine psychological maturation, requires looking into the shadow and accepting the burdens the truth imposes. When you refuse, you not only deny your self-growth, you also abnegate the civic duty to hold culture to a higher standard. What moral right do you have to remain an unexamined part in the play of others? Consider the paradox. You avoid thinking to preserve identity and social warmth, yet that very avoidance slowly corrodes any identity worth preserving. The herd protects by enforcing sameness, but sameness, over generations, withers originality and undermines resilience. A society that prizes safety above inquiry creates citizens ill-prepared for crisis, for nuance, for moral complexity. Nietzsche warned that this breeds nihilism, masked as decorum. Jung warned that the unlived soul projects its misery outward. The consequence is a culture vulnerable to demagogues, and to the seductive simplicity of false certainties. How long before the price of your comfort becomes the cost of public liberty? You can feel the pressure, private anxieties turning political, private shamans becoming public storms, small compromises snowballing into moral bankruptcy. The unseen trap is not only that you stop thinking, but that you become incapable of recognizing that you have stopped. It is a blindness maintained by neurological economy, cognitive bias, and cultural reinforcement, a triple lock that resists the smallest pry. The urgency, then, is existential. If thought is the crucible in which meaning is forged, then the corrosion of thinking threatens not only your interior life, but the civilization you inhabit. So you stand at the cold seat at the edge of the theater, feeling the draft. The question returns sharper: will you remain warm in the aisle, applauding certainty, or will you sit in the chill and let the lights be turned on, knowing that light may reveal ugliness, loss, and necessary change? The moment to decide is approaching. Beyond it lies a breakthrough that will upend these arguments and offer a path forward. But first, you must recognize the trap in which you now sit, its neurological comforts, its cultural scaffolding, and the moral stakes of remaining there. Will you? You have felt the draft from the aisle. Now imagine flipping the switch yourself and watching the theater's carefully painted set crumble into scrap. What if the very thing you thought was your weakness, the dread of solitude, the habit of agreement, is actually the lever to pry the world loose? This is the radical reframe. Avoidance is not merely a vice to be cured, but a strategy you've been trained to use. Rebellion is not only noise, it is method. If thinking is costly, treat cost as investment, not punishment. What would happen if you paid it deliberately? Begin with a paradox. To win the herd, you must often lose it. The courage Nietzsche lauds is not reckless contrariness, but a disciplined willingness to be wrong, lonely, and unstable for the sake of truth. Socrates drank hemlock because he would not barter the examined life for safety. Galileo bent toward the sun and paid for it. Martin Luther nailed his thesis and accepted excommunication. These are not saints, but craftsmen of thought who chose vulnerability as the price of insight. You can be the same in quieter ways, refusing comfortable applause, cultivating a public modesty that masks a private ferocity. The first counterintuitive move is to institutionalize discomfort. You do not have to leap into martyrdom. You can schedule small rebellions, a weekly 2-hour window of silence, a media fast, a cold shower that shocks habit. Train the prefrontal cortex the way an athlete trains a muscle. Nietzsche took long walks to think. Jung recommended active imagination and the disciplined confrontation with dreams to meet the shadow. You can set a ritual walking, writing, fasting from certainty that signals to your nervous system that you have permission to feel uncomfortable and to keep going. Adopt the mindset of the apprentice rather than the disciple. Apprenticeship implies practice, falsifiability, correction. Instead of declaring ideologies, you learn methods. Argue deliberately with the views you most cherish. Write the strongest case for the opposite. Conduct small experiments in belief. This is not mere skepticism for show, but a humility that produces depth. Who are you if not someone who can survive being wrong and return wiser? The paradox is that humility often creates authority. People trust those who admit fallibility because they can be tested. Use the tools of Jung to go deeper. Meet your shadow with scheduled curiosity. Write dialogues where your shadow speaks. List the impulses you scorn and trace their origin. Jung taught that integrating the shadow does not make you monstrous. It makes you whole and less likely to project. When you understand the motive behind your indignation, you are less a puppet of ressentiment and more an architect of intention. That knowledge is power. It frees you from being used by your own unnoticed scripts. Another counterintuitive tactic: seek small communities of dissidents rather than large tribes. The herd protects you with numbers. A handful of rigorous interlocutors sharpen thinking more quickly than 1,000 admirers. Think of historical salons, monastic orders, scientific circles, places where friction, not applause, was the currency. Choose people who will ask, "How did you reach that?" rather than, "Do you belong with us?" Iron sharpens iron. Solitude sharpens edges, but conversant solitude refines them into tools. Build infrastructural habits that make thinking inevitable. Keep a notebook always. Make a morning question you must answer, one that troubles you. Create a contrarian hour to play devil's advocate with your own positions. Use time blocking to protect thinking like a sacred ceremony. Remove cheap dopamine turn-off notifications. Mute the volume of the world. These are architectural moves. Change the room, change the mind. Nietzsche's aphorisms came from disciplined solitude. Jung's depths from disciplined introspection. You are not inventing asceticism. You are designing a laboratory for the soul. Practice what I'll call moral rehearsal. Imagine future conflicts and choose how you'd act, then role-play them. When the real moment arrives, your nervous system will have rehearsed courage. This is not hypocrisy. It is preparation. The free spirit Nietzsche admired is not the one who never fails, but the one who has rehearsed failure and knows how to rise with integrity. Cultivate a taste for paradox. Train yourself to hold two opposing truths without clutching for the easier certainty. Jung's individuation is born in the ability to bear contradiction, to allow that your persona is not the entire person. The moment you find boredom or discomfort, ask, what truth might I be avoiding? Often boredom is a shield against change. Lean into it. Boredom is where new associations gestate. Make public experiments. Where possible, publish a half-formed idea. Admit its limits. Invite correction. Vulnerability in public is a political act. It models a culture of learning rather than preening. The world needs examples more than precepts. Your honest hesitation will do more to free others than your polished certainties. And remember the most subversive thought. Power is not the opposite of thought. Thought, properly disciplined, becomes power of a different order, sovereignty over your inner economy. Nietzsche's higher types did not merely reject the herd. They created values. When you think courageously, you shape private values into public goods. Jung would add that individuation is service. The more integrated you are, the less you draw on the herd's applause, and the more you contribute to collective maturity. You are not being asked to be heroic in a dramatic sense. You are being offered a method. Turn discomfort into curriculum, solitude into workshop, error into teacher. Start with one strict promise. For 30 days, observe and record one belief you hold without evidence, then deliberately interrogate it. That is a small revolution, one that will leak quietly into friendships, habits, and voting booths. Imagine then stepping out of the aisle into the cold light, not as exile, but as pioneer. The theater's applause will continue. The herd will not collapse because you refuse its comfort. But you will have discovered a core fact. Thinking is an art you can learn, a rebellion you can practice, a life you can design. That discovery is not merely intellectual. It is a reclamation, a slow remaking of a self who can bear ambiguity, face the shadow, and speak with a voice that is owed to nobody but reality itself. Will you begin? You have learned the maps, the herd's economy, the shadow's attic, the neural shortcuts, but there is one final fact that reframes everything you've already felt as initiation rather than failure. Imagine standing under the theater's single, raw bulb and realizing the audience is not only watching a play. They are also auditioning for a script you have been writing unconsciously. The ultimate truth is this. Thinking is not merely an instrument for truth-seeking. It is the labor of value creation. When you think truly, you do more than revise beliefs, you make worlds. Does that feel excessive? Consider how every conviction you've defended has performed a metaphysical job. It kept fear tolerable, justified your attachments, arranged your days. Values are not decorative, they are constitutional. Nietzsche's higher men were terrifying because they understood this. To think is to assume the role of legislator of the self. You no longer receive values like mail. You forge them like metal. Jung adds a clinical echo. You cannot create what you do not first know in yourself. Individuation is not a private luxury, but a metaphysical responsibility. Integrate the shadow, or let it draft your laws. Now the paradox becomes luminous. The herd fears thinking, because thinking transfers sovereignty to you. Power, then, is not the privilege of not thinking, but the consequence of bearing thought's burden. The safety of inherited values seduces because it spares you the agonizing admission that meaning must be chosen, shaped, defended. Would you rather be warm in moral infancy or cold at the anvil of creation? Which is truer to life, the prepackaged certainty, or the raw, dazzling, terrifying act of declaring what matters? This explains the old ache you thought was cowardice. It was initiation wearing a cheap suit. Those sleepless nights, the arguments you lost, the loneliness after you first questioned a sacred story, these were not signs that thought rejected you, but that you were being called to a larger economy. Think of your past struggles as a crucible. Pain and exile were not punishments only. They were the first drafts of your authorship. Nietzsche's brutal clarity shows that most never rewrite their drafts. They memorize someone else's script and call it identity. Jung would say you did not fail to grow, you deferred the labor of becoming whole. What if the final revelation is not a condemnation, but an emancipation? If values are made, and catastrophe contains a promise, when inherited meaning collapses, you are offered a vacant throne. That vacancy is terrifying, yes, but also luminous, an opening in which honest thought can create forms, meanings, and practices that are resilient because they arise from integration rather than avoidance. Responsibility becomes the medicine of nihilism. You stop praying to preordained structures and start building. So what does this mean for your daily life? It means reframing cost as investment, solitude as workshop, failure as draft. When a belief is endangered, do not panic, you have opportunity. Ask a new question. What value do I want to be able to defend when everything else is stripped away? This is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a practical test. Bring Jung's method to this work dialogue with the shadow. Listen to dreams. Notice where projection lights up your rage. Each piece you integrate reduces the tyrannies you once outsourced to platitudes. Each small courage accrues into a moral architecture that is both individual and generative. You will inevitably pay a currency others avoid: ridicule, ostracism, the thin, cold air of solitude. But the payoff is sovereignty, a life whose terms you help write. Nietzsche's terrifying freedom is the liberation from being a repository of other people's resentments. Jung's individuation is the piece of a psyche that no longer needs to mobilize projection to survive. The deeper revelation: freedom is not relief from burden, but the alignment of burden with authorship. You carry weight, but the weight is now chosen. This shifts the moral question from "why should I think?" to "what will I create with my thinking?" It converts apathy into possibility. Your choices shape not only your inner world, but the collective ambient air. When you choose to think, you supply oxygen in a room growing thin. When you refuse, you add to the damping of thought's light. You are therefore both solitary artisan and civic actor. The private economies of courage cascade into public life. Integrated individuals resist demagoguery, not because they are infallible, but because they are practiced in the painful humility of correction. Do not expect a single epiphany to solve everything. Thinking is a craft. Its masterpieces are composite drafts revised, shadows integrated, experiments failed, and rerun. Start by deciding that your discomfort is currency. Invest it. Make 3 small, irrevocable promises to yourself. Keep a notebook for heretical ideas. Schedule weekly silence, and publish 1 half-formed thought and invite correction. These moves are small, but they shift the ecology of your mind. Like any ecosystem, once a keystone species appears, the rest follow. And now, the cinematic close. Picture the theater again. The light goes up. The painted backdrop peels. You watch paint flake like old seasons falling away. The audience murmurs, some reach for their programs. Others stand, confused. You walk down the aisle without warmth from applause. Your footsteps sound strange in the vaulted room. On the stage, the script you once unconsciously followed lies in a heap. You are not an exile here. You are a smith. In your hands, the script becomes raw material. You feel the heat and smell the iron of possibility. In the incandescent blur, you see two doors. One returns you to the aisle's comfortable applause. The other opens into a narrow corridor lit by your own match. Which door will you choose? The match demands patience. It will not make you loved by the many. It will, however, teach you how to be loved by truth. If you take that corridor, your likeliest fate is not glory, but a peculiar integrity. The ability to suffer without illusion, to act without performance, to love without projecting. This is not heroism in the street lamp sense. It is the quiet, volcanic work of creating a self who can stand in the full light and keep working. So stand now, match in hand. Strike it. Let the smell of sulfur be the scent of beginnings. The theater will continue to hum. The city will not stop its routines. But within you, a different script can be written, one by a thinker who learned to pay the price, who learned that thought is not a luxury, but an act of world-making. Be the kind of person who does not only consume answers, but composes them. The world needs more composers than copyists. Will you become one?